In 1855 Alexander II began his reign as Tsar of Russia, and presided over a period of political and social reform, notably the emancipation of serfs in 1861 and the lifting of censorship. His successor, Alexander III, pursued a policy of repression and restricted public expenditure, but continued land and labor reforms. This was a period of population growth and significant industrialization. Nevertheless, Russia remained a largely rural country. Political movements of the time included the Populists, anarchists, and Marxists. A revolutionary organization called People's Will assassinated Alexander II. Another current of thought was embodied in the Slavophiles, who opposed modernization and westernization. Russia continued to expand its empire, occupying the Caucasus, Tashkent and Samarkand, while denying nationhood to its Polish and Ukrainian territories. In foreign affairs, the period began with the conclusion of the Crimean War. Russian policy brought it into conflict with other European powers, in particular Austria-Hungary, as it sought to extend influence over the European portions of the receding Ottoman Empire and regain naval access to the Black Sea. This culminated in a successful war with the Ottoman Empire in 1877 to 1878, followed by the Treaty of San Stefano and Congress of Berlin in 1878, by which an independent Bulgaria came into being, and by acquisition of former Ottoman territories in the South Caucasus. Russia joined Germany and Austria-Hungary in the League of the Three Emperors, but friction continued with both partners over Bulgaria, and the alliance with Germany came to an end in 1890. Economic development. Russia's population growth rate from 1850 to 1910 was the fastest of all the major powers except for the United States. Between 1850 and 1900, Russia's population doubled, but it remained chiefly rural well into the 20th century. The Proclamation Law of 1861 freed the peasants from dependence on the landowners and granted them all the land previously worked by the peasants for their own use. Agriculture remained in the hands of peasants, who together constituted about 4/5 of the rural population, and former landowners. By the end of the 19th century, Russia was largest producer and exporter of cereals in the world. Owing to the development of agriculture, Russia gradually assumed a more important position in the world trade. Industrial growth was significant, although unsteady, and in absolute terms it was not extensive. Russia's industrial regions included Moscow, the central regions of European Russia, St. Petersburg, the Baltic cities, Russian Poland, some areas along the lower Don and Dnieper rivers, and the southern Ural Mountains. By 1890, Russia had about 32,000 kilometers of railroads and 1.4 million factory workers, most of whom worked in the textile industry. Between 1860 and 1890, annual coal production had grown about 1,200% to over 6.6 million tons, and iron and steel production had more than doubled to 2 million tons per year. The state budget had more than doubled, however, and debt expenditures had quadrupled, constituting 28% of official expenditures in 1891. Reforms and their limits. Tsar Alexander II, who succeeded Nicholas I in 1855, was a man of a liberal disposition, who saw no alternative but to implement change in the aftermath of the Crimean War. Alexander initiated substantial reforms in education, the government, the judiciary, and the military. In 1861 he proclaimed the emancipation of about 20 million privately held serfs. Local commissions effected emancipation by giving land and freedom to the serfs. The land allotted to the peasants was bought from the owners with the state's assistance. The government issued bonds to the landowners for this purpose and collected redemption payments from the peasants at the rate of 5% of the total cost yearly. The government had envisioned that the 50,000 former landlords who possessed estates of more than 1.1 square kilometers would thrive without serfs and would continue to provide loyal political and administrative leadership in the countryside. The government also had expected that peasants would produce sufficient crops for their own consumption and for export sales, thereby helping to finance most of the government's expenses, imports, and foreign debt. Reforms of local government closely followed emancipation. In 1864, most local government in the European part of Russia was organized into provincial and district-elected self-government, which were made up of representatives of all classes and were responsible for local schools, public health, roads, prisons, food supply, and other concerns. In 1870, elected city councils, or Duma, were formed, dominated by property owners and constrained by provincial governors and the police. The Zemstvia and Duma raised taxes and levied labor to support their activities. In 1864, Alexander II implemented the Great Judicial Reform. In major towns, it established courts with juries. In general, the judicial system functioned effectively, but the government lacked the finances and cultural influence to extend the court system to the villages, where traditional peasant justice continued to operate with minimal interference from provincial officials. The Russian judicial system was modeled after contemporary French and German law. Each case had to be decided on its merits and not on precedents. This approach remained in place ever since. Other major reforms took place in the educational and cultural spheres. Censorship, which had stifled opinion under Nicholas, was greatly relaxed, and public opinion found a voice. This greatly facilitated the government's effort to eradicate corruption, red tape and inefficiency. Universities had gained autonomy. The government encouraged education. It was during Alexander's reign that the education of the peasant masses started on a vast scale. The central government attempted to act through the Zemstvia to establish uniform curricula for elementary schools. In the financial sphere, Russia established the State Bank in 1866, which put the national currency on a firmer footing. The Ministry of Finance supported railroad development, which facilitated vital export activity, but it was cautious and moderate in its foreign ventures. The ministry also founded the Peasant Land Bank in 1882 to enable enterprising farmers to acquire more land. The Ministry of Internal Affairs countered this policy, however, by establishing the Nobles Land Bank in 1885 to forestall foreclosures of mortgages. The reform of the military service was the last of the principal reforms in Alexander's reign. The Franco-Prussian War demonstrated the necessity of building a modern army. The old system of long-term service for a limited number of recruits was abandoned, as being too heavy a burden for the people and as providing practically no reserves. The new conscription system, which provided for a short term of active service followed by several years in the reserve, was introduced by Dmitry Milyutin in 1874. It was drawn on democratic lines, calling to the colors all young men of 21 without distinction of class. Exemption was only granted to young men who were the sole breadwinners of the families. It also gave the army a role in teaching many peasants to read and in pioneering medical education for women. Alexander's far-reaching policy, however, did not bring political peace to Russia. In 1881, revolutionaries assassinated Alexander II. His son Alexander III initiated a period of political counter-reform. He strengthened the security police, reorganizing it into an agency known as the Okhrana, gave it extraordinary powers, and placed it under the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Dmitry Tolstoy, Alexander's Minister of Internal Affairs, instituted the use of land captains, who were noble overseers of districts, and he restricted the power of the Zemstvos and the Duma. Alexander III assigned his former tutor, conservative Konstantin Pobedonosiev, to be the procurator of the Holy Synod of the Orthodox Church and Ivan Dalianov to be the Minister of Education. Alexander III put the most rigid economy into practice. The civil list of the imperial family was reduced, and estimates for the army, navy and civil service were cut down considerably. This allowed the introduction of a series of financial reforms which tended to ameliorate the condition of the peasantry. The poll tax was abolished in 1886. A law was passed to accelerate legal transfer of the land allotted to the peasants in 1861. The payments due from them for this land were greatly reduced. Crown lands were made available for leasing or purchase to the peasants on advantageous terms, and great stretches of crown lands in eastern Russia and Siberia were opened for peasant emigration and resettlement. Labor legislation was first introduced in 1882 with the creation of the Inspectorate of Factories, the regulation of working hours and the limitation of female and juvenile labor. Alexander's financial reforms prepared the way for the introduction of gold standard, which was carried out in the first years of his successor's reign. He also continued a policy of intensive railway building. Here the greatest event was the laying down of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1891. During the second half of the 19th century, a faction of so-called Slavophiles emerged in intellectual circles. They were convinced that Peter the Great had made a mistake in trying to modernize and westernize the country, and that Russia's salvation lay in the rejection of Western ideas. Slavophiles believed that while the West polluted itself with science, atheism, materialism, and wealth, they should return to a simple peasant-based society centered on the Orthodox faith. The government rejected these ideas since it felt the need for rapid modernization. It followed that Russia, despite being a polyglot empire with dozens of nationalities and languages, was anything but friendly to the nationalistic aspirations of minorities. Poles fared especially badly since they had been enemies for centuries and because they had revolted in 1830 and 1863. As Russian industrialization progressed, Poland fared quite well, but other areas like the Ukraine remained backward, a problem worsened by the clumsy land reforms of Alexander II. Jews in Russia proper and the Ukraine were subject to bad discrimination, especially since they were associated with either Poles or with revolutionary movements. Most of the latter were also highly nationalistic and oblivious to the minority problem. Even the Bolsheviks were clueless until after they had taken power in 1917. Despite industrialization, Russia was still overwhelmingly rural and backward at the start of World War I. Moscow and St. Petersburg were the only cities with any significant industry, since most workers were fresh off the farm and totally uneducated. The main impetus of revolution came from middle-class college graduates frustrated at the inefficiency of Russian society. Thus, Russia managed to achieve at least a veneer of industrialization by 1914. Along with this came all of the abuses already encountered in the West. such as child labor and unsafe working conditions. But while Britain, the US, Germany, and others were eventually able to rid themselves of those problems, Russia found it much more difficult due to inadequate infrastructure and the lack of an honest, educated bureaucracy. During the latter years of the 19th century, revolutionary groups of all flavors proliferated, some of which sought to reject modernity altogether and turn the clock back to the Middle Ages. Foreign affairs after the Crimean War. After the Crimean War, Russia pursued cautious and well-calculated foreign policies. The Treaty of Paris, signed at the end of the Crimean War, had demilitarized the Black Sea and deprived Russia of the southern strip of Bessarabia, located at the mouth of the Danube River. The treaty gave the West European powers the nominal duty of protecting Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, removing that role from Russia, which had been designated as such a protector in the 1774 Treaty of Caucasus. The first phase of Alexander II's foreign policy had the primary goal of altering the Treaty of Paris to regain Russian naval access to the Black Sea. Russian statesmen viewed Britain and Austria as opposed to that goal, so foreign policy concentrated on good relations with France, Prussia, and the United States. Following the Crimean War, Russia revived its expansionist policies. Russian troops first moved to gain control of the Caucasus region, where the revolts of Muslim tribesmen, Chechens, Circassians, and Dagestanis had continued despite numerous Russian campaigns in the 19th century. Once the forces of Alexander Baryutinsky had captured the legendary Chechen rebel leader Shamil in 1859, the army resumed the expansion into Central Asia that had begun under Nicholas I. The capture of Tashkent was a significant victory over the Kokand Khanate, part of which was annexed in 1866. By 1867, Russian forces had captured enough territory to form the Gubernia of Turkestan, the capital of which was Tashkent. The Bukhara Khanate then lost the crucial Samarkand area to Russian forces in 1868. To avoid alarming Britain, which had strong interests in protecting nearby India, Russia left the Bukharan territories directly bordering Afghanistan and Persia nominally independent. The Central Asian Khanates retained a degree of autonomy until 1917. Russia followed the United States, Britain, and France in establishing relations with Japan, and, together with Britain and France, Russia obtained concessions from China consequent to the Second Opium War. Under the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the Treaty of Beijing in 1860, China ceded to Russia extensive trading rights and regions adjacent to the Amur and Ussuri rivers and allowed Russia to begin building a port and naval base at Vladivostok. As part of the foreign policy goals in Europe, Russia initially gave guarded support to France's anti-Austrian diplomacy. A weak Franco-Russian Entente soured, however, when France backed a Polish uprising against Russian rule in 1863. Russia then aligned itself more closely with Prussia by approving the unification of Germany in exchange for a revision of the Treaty of Paris and the remilitarization of the Black Sea. These diplomatic achievements came at a London conference in 1871, following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. After 1871, Germany, united under Prussian leadership, was the strongest continental power in Europe. In 1873, Germany formed the loosely knit League of the Three Emperors with Russia and Austria-Hungary to prevent them from forming an alliance with France. Nevertheless, Austro-Hungarian and Russian ambitions clashed in the Balkans, where rivalries among Slavic nationalities and anti-Ottoman sentiment seethed. In the 1870s, Russian nationalist opinion became a serious domestic factor in its support for liberating Balkan Christians from Ottoman rule and making Bulgaria and Serbia quasi-protectorates of Russia. From 1875 to 1877, the Balkan Crisis escalated with the rebellion in Bosnia and Herzegovina and insurrection in Bulgaria, which the Ottoman Turks suppressed with such great cruelty that Serbia, but none of the West European powers, declared war. In early 1877, Russia came to the rescue of beleaguered Serbia when it went to war with the Ottoman Empire of 1877 to 1878. Within 1 year, Russian troops were nearing Constantinople and the Ottomans surrendered. Russia's nationalist diplomats and generals persuaded Alexander II to force the Ottomans to sign the Treaty of San Stefano in March 1878, creating an enlarged, independent Bulgaria that stretched into the southwestern Balkans. Another significant result of the 1877–78 Russo-Turkish War in Russia's favor was the acquisition from the Ottomans of the provinces of Batumi, Ardahan, and Kars in the South Caucasus, which were transformed into the militarily administered regions of Batumi Oblast and Kars Oblast, to replace Muslim refugees who had fled across the new frontier into Ottoman territory. The Russian authorities settled large numbers of Christians from an ethnically diverse range of communities in Kars Oblast, particularly the Greek Orthodox Georgians and Caucasus Greeks, and Christian but mainly non-Orthodox Armenians, all of whom hoped to achieve their own regional ambitions on the back of the Russian Empire. When Britain threatened to declare war over the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano, an exhausted Russia backed down. At the Congress of Berlin in July 1878, Russia agreed to the creation of a smaller Bulgaria. Russian nationalists were furious with Austria-Hungary and Germany for failing to back Russia, but the Tsar accepted a revived and strengthened League of the Three Emperors as well as Austro-Hungarian hegemony in the Western Balkans. Russian diplomatic and military interests subsequently refocused on Central Asia, where Russia had quelled a series of uprisings in the 1870s, and Russia incorporated hitherto independent emirates into the empire. Britain renewed its concerns in 1881 when Russian troops occupied Turkmen lands on the Persian and Afghan borders, but Germany lent diplomatic support to Russian advances, and an Anglo-Russian war was averted. Meanwhile, Russia's sponsorship of Bulgarian independence brought negative results as the Bulgarians, angry at Russia's continuing interference in domestic affairs, sought the support of Austria-Hungary. In the dispute that arose between Austria-Hungary and Russia, Germany took a firm position toward Russia while mollifying the Tsar with a bilateral defensive alliance. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 between Germany and Russia. Within a year, Russo-German acrimony led to Otto von Bismarck's forbidding further loans to Russia, and France replaced Germany as Russia's financier. When Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck in 1890, the loose Russo-Prussian Entente collapsed after having lasted for more than 25 years. 3 years later, Russia allied itself with France by entering into a joint military convention, which matched the dual alliance formed in 1879 by Germany and Austria-Hungary. Revolutionary movements. Alexander II's reforms, particularly the lifting of state censorship, fostered the expression of political and social thought. The regime relied on journals and newspapers to gain support for its domestic and foreign policies, but liberal, nationalist, and radical writers also helped to mold public opinion in opposition to Tsarism, to private property, and to the imperial state. Because many intellectuals, professionals, peasants, and workers shared these opposition sentiments, the regime regarded the publications and the radical organizations as dangerous. For the 1860s through the 1880s, Russian radicals, collectively known as Populists, focused chiefly on the peasantry, whom they identified as the people. The leaders of the populist movement included radical writers, idealists, and advocates of terrorism. In the 1860s, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, the most important radical writer of the period, posited that Russia could bypass capitalism and move directly to socialism. His most influential work describes the role of an individual over superior nature who guides a new, revolutionary generation. Other radicals such as the incendiary anarchist Mikhail Bakunin and his terrorist collaborator, Sergei Nechayev, urged direct action. The Kama Petatikichov argued against the advocates of Marxism, maintaining that a centralized revolutionary band had to seize power before capitalism could fully develop. Disputing his views, the moralist and individualist Petr Lavrov made a call to the people, which hundreds of idealists heeded in 1873 and 1874 by leaving the schools for the countryside to try to generate a mass movement among the married. The populist campaign failed, however, when the peasants showed hostility to the urban idealists and the government began to consider nationalist opinion more seriously. The radicals reconsidered their approach, and in 1876 they formed a propagandist organization called Land and Liberty, which leaned toward terrorism. This orientation became stronger 3 years later, when the group renamed itself the People's Will, the name under which the radicals carried out the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. In 1879, Georgy Plekhanov formed a propagandist faction of Land and Liberty called Black Repartition, which advocated redistributing all land to the peasantry. This group studied Marxism, which paradoxically was principally concerned with urban industrial workers. The People's Will remained underground,